Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading The Regularity of the Dhamma. May 22, 2006. There's a school of thought that says each present moment is so new and so unpredictable that you shouldn't bring any preconceived notions from the past to apply to it. Any conditions you pick up from the past obscure the freshness of the present moment, so your duty as a meditator is to be totally present in an unmediated way to the raw data of the senses. By allowing yourself to be fully immersed in the raw data of the present moment, you'll instinctively know the proper response. There are no rules. All bets are off as to what's going to be the appropriate response to any particular moment, any particular situation. That school of thought leaves you pretty high and dry when things get difficult. It throws you into the present moment with no lifesaver at all. Fortunately, that's not how the Buddha taught. The Buddha said that there's a regularity to the way things happen. That's how he describes dependent co-arising. This regularity of the Dhamma. He doesn't say that everything is predetermined from the past, or that by knowing the past, you'll be able to predict what's going to happen in the present or on into the future. He simply says that there's a regularity to the way things are shaped in your experience, and certain things tend to be the shaping factors. In one analysis of dependent co-arising, he describes these factors as name and form on the one hand, and consciousness on the other. These two influence each other. Form is the form of the body. For example, you're sitting here right now with the form of the body, your sense of the body, how it feels from within. That sense of form is made up of solidity, warmth, liquid sensations, and energy. The four elements are four properties. As for name, it includes feeling, perception, attention, intention, and contact. Consciousness, he says, lands on these factors of name and form, and then things proliferate out of that. Under the heading of name, the two most important factors are intention and attention. Other ways of describing dependent co-arising draw out this importance. Sometimes, prior to name and form, they list fabrication, sankhara, which is the intentional element in experience, whether physical, verbal, or mental. Physical or bodily fabrication is the breath, the intentional element in how you sense the breath, how you create the experience of the breath. Verbal fabrication is directed thought and evaluation, which includes an intentional element. Mental fabrication is feeling and perception. There's an intentional element there as well. So the intention is what's important, and it plays itself out in feeling, perception, and form. Prior to fabrication comes ignorance. Ignorance means not seeing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths, in other words, applying inappropriate attention. When you look at things in an inappropriate way, you frame issues in an inappropriate way, which means that your fabrications are going to lead to suffering. All the other elements of name and form and consciousness will tend towards suffering and stress as well. But you can change that way of attending to things. You can look at things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Where is the stress? What are you doing to cause it? Where is there freedom from stress? And what kind of actions lead to that freedom? When you look in these terms, then the fabrications of your intentions go in a different direction. Name and form and consciousness, all the other factors of your experience, go in a different direction, toward the end of suffering. This is the regularity of the Dhamma. We tend to think of dependent co-arising as an extremely complex and abstruse teaching, and as the Buddha pointed out, it is complex, it's not easy. Still, it does give us guidance in how to approach each present moment, where to look, how to look. One of the interesting things about dependent co-arising is that all these factors come prior to sensory contact. Even before you see sights, listen to sounds, and so forth, there's an intentional element already in play. You have an agenda. What you're looking for, how you're going to look at things. You bring that to each present moment. So it's important to bring the right way of framing issues, framing questions, to everything you sense. Remember this as you practice. These are the important elements. Intention and attention. Everything else springs from there. When things come up in the present moment, how do you look at them? Try to look at them simply in terms of stress and lack of stress. Which intentions and ways of attending to things lead to stress? Which ones bring it to an end? Try to put aside any ideas of yourself or what lies outside of yourself. Put aside questions of what lies behind all of this. Just look at things as they're directly experienced as stress. This is a mode of perception that's important to develop. The Buddha calls this mode emptiness. Seeing what's present or what's not present, particularly present or not present in terms of stress or disturbance. That's where the big issue lies, and your duties as a meditator come from looking at these things in this way. If you see stress, you try to comprehend it. To do that, you need to develop certain qualities of mind. That's the path. You need to put the mind in a position where it really can look at stress coming and going, and not feel threatened by it, especially when the stress is really painful, really burdensome. Our normal reaction when we feel stress and strain is to say, "This is happening to me." And when something bad happens to you, there's a different set of imperatives. The imperative is to get rid of it, to get it out of the range of what you identify as me. But if you can pull out of that sense of me surrounding your experience and simply look at the stress happening right here, right now from a position of well-being, the well-being that comes from right concentration, then the imperatives are different. The imperative is to understand the stress, to see what's causing it, and then to abandon the cause. This is why we practice right concentration. To put the mind in a good position to see things clearly and carry out its appropriate duties. Actually, when the mind is in right concentration, you're standing where the Buddha stood when he discovered all of these things. It's from this point of view that you can see. This is the intention, this is the act of attention, this is the stress, this is the cause of stress. You can see them clearly because you're looking at them from the right spot. Years back I went on a camping trip to Powell Point, which is the southern tip of a plateau in Utah, over 10,000 feet in elevation. The guidebook said that you could see a good third of southern Utah from that spot. We thought we were following the right directions, but we made a wrong turn and ended up in an outlook over Henderson Canyon. Still, we thought we were at Powell Point. The book said the road would end, and then from there you had to walk out on a point. Well, we found a point that we could walk out to. From there, the book said, you could look out and see this, that, and the other thing. So we identified the sights. This was this, that was that, and this was the other thing. But then there was a huge plateau looming up to our east, which wasn't mentioned in the book at all. Only after a good while did we realize that that was Powell Point. We had made a wrong turn. We were standing somewhere else. So, the next day we made our way up to Powell Point, and then we saw what the guidebook was actually referring to. We realized that the this, that, and the other thing were not the this, that, and the other thing we thought we saw yesterday. We had labeled things wrong because we were standing in the wrong place. If you want to understand what the Buddha is talking about, you have to put yourself here, right at the present moment, where the mind is immersed in the form, the breath energy, of the body. That's where the Buddha stood. If there's going to be any directed thought and evaluation related to the breath, any feelings and perceptions will be the feelings and perceptions of a mind really focused on the breath. As the mind gets more and more still, those fabrications fall away. Directed thoughts and evaluations fall away. The movement of the breath falls away. All you have is a still breath energy filling the body, a clear, bright awareness filling the body. That's Powell Point. From there you can see the Henry Mountains, you can see the Escalante region, you can see Bryce Canyon, the way they're described in the book. In other words, from this point you can see stress, and you're in a position where you can really comprehend it because you don't feel so threatened by it. You're not compelled by your old imperative, which was to get rid of it. You attend to things in the right way. You see things simply in terms of stress, its cause, the path leading to its ending, and its ending. This is the framework you're supposed to bring to each present moment. In other words, you see things in terms of the Four Noble Truths, and your intention is to perform the duties appropriate to each. When you develop that intention, it's bound to lead you to the end of all suffering and stress. So this is the regularity of the Dhamma. You may not be able to bring purely appropriate attention to every moment of your life, but you can get used to looking at each moment in terms of identifying your intention and examining how you frame the events of your life. Do the narratives get in the way of your seeing things in terms of skillful and unskillful intentions? Or do they actually help? You should approach each situation with these thoughts in mind. Where is the stress here? What can you do to at least minimize the stress, the harm, the disturbance, whatever is a burden for you or the people around you? This way, you come to each present moment armed with a knowledge of the regularity of the Dhamma, where you should focus your attention, and what the main priority should be, which is to keep on the path. In this way the Buddha doesn't leave you high and dry, for no matter what the situation, this is how to look at it. In terms of the Four Noble Truths, your intention should be to try to comprehend the suffering, the stress, wherever it may be in that moment, and to develop the factors that will enable you to comprehend suffering. You may have other issues, for example, when you're dealing with people. It's very different from sitting here with your eyes closed, but your basic framework can be the same. Once you've got this framework firmly in mind, you can go wherever you want and deal with any situation that confronts you, because you're working from a framework that, instead of leading to more suffering and stress, actually helps bring them to an end. And that way, whatever the situation, you're on the path. The ability to keep all this in mind is mindfulness. That, combined with appropriate attention and the right intention, is what turns each moment into a moment of the practice, regardless of the situation. So this is how the complexity of dependent co-arising gives you tools for the present moment, tools that you can use for the sake of your own well-being, and the well-being of all the people around you. Each moment may be new, but it follows a pattern. Always keep that pattern in mind. The Path of Mistakes. March 26, 2007. An essential aspect of Buddhist practice is that we have to learn how to make use of things we'll eventually have to learn how to let go of. We know that at some point the practice involves letting go of desire. But we need to cultivate skillful desire to get to that point. Ultimately, the practice leads to the total end of fabrication, but the Noble Eightfold Path is a type of fabrication. As the Buddha once said, it's the ultimate level of fabrication. In fact, when you look at the factors of the path, you realize that they're made up of the aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrication, consciousness. These all have to play a role in the path, which means we have to learn how to change our attitude toward the aggregates. Instead of just clinging to them as us or ours, we learn how to use them as elements in the path. The important point here is to realize that these things have to be used in a skillful way. When you come to the path, it's useful to reflect on skills you've developed in the past as an artist, a cook, a carpenter, or a musician. Whatever skills you've worked on in the past, it's good to reflect on how you became skillful, and particularly how you learned how to deal with mistakes. Learning from your mistakes is essential to developing any kind of skill. It's expected that you're going to make mistakes. The teacher tries to help you avoid the really unnecessary ones by pointing them out in advance. In other words, some mistakes are more avoidable than others. But a large part of the practice lies in learning how to learn from your mistakes and not get knocked off course by them. We all like to hear that there's a stage in the practice when you finally attain a certain level of awareness, a certain level of insight, and it's guaranteed that from that point on nothing you might do would be a mistake. You may have heard about the choicelessness of the path. You finally get on the path and realize that there's only one thing to do. If you just do what the path tells you to do, or what seems right at any one time, You're guaranteed that there will be no mistakes. But that's not the way it works. Even arahants make mistakes. They're virtues in terms of the basics of a virtuous life. The 5 precepts are unshakable. They don't make those mistakes anymore, but simple mistakes in saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. That's human. It has nothing to do with defilements of the mind. It's simply the fact that we're human beings with limitations. What's different about arahants is that they continue to learn from their mistakes. They don't get knocked off course by them because they have no conceit that's going to be challenged by the mistake, destroyed by the mistake, or feel threatened by the mistake. But for those of us on the path, that's an issue we still have to deal with. This issue of conceit, our narcissism. We don't like the thought of having to make mistakes, but there's no other way we're going to learn. This is why the Buddha gives so many instructions on how to learn from your mistakes, how to deal with a mistake, so that it actually becomes an important element in the path. There are the instructions to Rahula. When you realize you've done something that's been harmful, you resolve not to repeat it. You also go talk it over with other people who are on the path to see what insight you can gain from them. In other words, you admit the mistake, you learn how to recognize it, and that involves developing a certain amount of perceptiveness right there. And as for learning from the counsel of others, we sometimes assume that the Buddha's instructions to the Kalamas tell you to go by your own sense of right and wrong. But in fact, if you look carefully at his words, you realize that this assumption has nothing to do with what the Buddha actually said. He said that you can't go totally on the instructions of others, but you can't go on your own preconceived ideas about what's right and wrong, either. You have to look at what you're doing, along with the results of what you're doing and what you've done. Then learn to recognize when you've caused harm and when you haven't. At the same time, you take into consideration the counsel of the wise. That, of course, requires you to learn how to recognize who's wise and who's not. So in one way it does throw the whole issue back on you, but it's not that you have to totally reinvent the Dhamma wheel as you practice. There is guidance, and when you learn how to make the best use of guidance, it gives you quite a leg up. There's another passage where a student of the Jains comes to the Buddha. The Jains were teaching that whoever kills, steals, has illicit sex, tells lies, or takes intoxicants is going to go to hell. This person wanted to know what the Buddha had to say about that, and the Buddha replied that if you hear that teaching and you realize you've done these things in the past, that pretty much consigns you to hell right there. It makes things hopeless. This is why the Buddha taught in a different way. He taught that these activities are unwise. They should be avoided because they cause harm. You look at what you've done and you realize you've made mistakes like this. So what's the proper attitude to develop toward those mistakes? It's to resolve not to do them again. At the same time, you realize that if you let yourself get tied up in remorse about your past mistakes, it's not going to undo the old mistake and it's going to make it less likely that you're going to do well in the future because remorse saps your strength. The proper attitude is to learn how to recognize a mistake and simply resolve, I'm not going to repeat it. The next step is to develop the sublime attitudes: limitless goodwill, limitless compassion, limitless empathetic joy, limitless equanimity. Learn how to cultivate these emotions because they help keep you on the right track, strengthen your resolve not to be harmful, and also teach you where your limitations are. What you can do, what you can't do in terms of correcting the situation within yourself and the world around you. Again, these attitudes, too, are fabrications. It's not that our nature is innately kind or innately bad. These attitudes are things you have to learn how to cultivate. They're fabrications. So what happens when you come up against some ill will inside you, some resentment, or an inability to accept the situation as it is? When you look at that emotion, you realize it's composed of all the different elements of fabrication. There's the way you breathe. There are the directed thoughts. The way you direct your thinking around that topic. There's the way you evaluate what's happening, and there are also your feelings and perceptions about what's happening. These are all the elements of fabrication that go into any thought, any emotion. So, to begin with, You want to learn how to take your unskillful emotions apart. When you find yourself thinking in an unskillful way, when an unskillful emotion comes up with regard either to yourself or somebody else, ask yourself, what kind of breathing is going on here? How does the breathing affect that emotion? What if I were to make the breath more skillful, making it smooth, making it full, making it restful? Will that help get the body out of the grip of the emotion? Then look at how you're thinking about the issue. Is there some way you could change your thoughts about the issue? Look at it from a different perspective. A lot of the Buddha's teachings, say, on anger, are just that. Look at the situation from another angle. Look at the good in the people who make you angry. After all, you need their good as much as they do. If all you can see are the bad traits of other people, it's like being in a desert. You're hot, tired, trembling, thirsty, and the goodness of other people is like water. You're not in some Olympian position where you can look down on the human race and say, well, they're bad, and these people are bad, and those people are bad, and it doesn't affect you at all. It does affect you to be constantly focusing on other people's bad habits. It's like that New Yorker cartoon of the two female poodles sitting at a bar with grim, sneering looks on their faces, saying, they're all sons of bitches. When everyone is a son of a bitch, what does that make you? So try to think about the situation in a way that helps you realize that you need the water of their goodness. This waters the goodness of your own heart, this change in the element of perception, along with directed thought and evaluation. As for the feelings that come up, learn not to identify with them. Just watch them. Okay, these feelings are results of actions. They, in and of themselves, are not skillful or unskillful, but the way you perceive them and the thoughts you build around them, those can be skillful and unskillful. So learn how to step back. In this way you use your understanding of fabrication to deconstruct unskillful emotions, unskillful mind states, and then to develop skillful emotions and skillful mind states in their place. We don't usually like the idea of constructing an emotion or fabricating an emotion. It seems too artificial. But we do it all the time. It's simply that we're not conscious of it. So as you're meditating, what are you doing? You're working with the breath. That's one form of fabrication. Try to make the breath comfortable. When there's a sense of tension anywhere in the body, learn how to breathe around it, or breathe through it, to relieve as much of the tension as you can without totally losing focus. You direct your thoughts to the breath. You evaluate the breath. What kind of breathing feels good right now? This is an important part of the practice because it teaches you how to develop your powers of observation on a subtle level. You're learning to recognize your actions and their results. You're learning how to read those actions, read those results. And if the results aren't what you want, you can think of ways of improving them. That all comes under evaluation. Then there are feelings. You try to work with the breath in such a way as to develop feelings of ease and fullness. There are also perceptions. How do you perceive your breath? What mental picture do you have of the breath? How does that mental picture affect the way you actually breathe? Can you think of the breath as an energy field in the body, that your whole awareness of the body right now is all breath, different levels of breath energy? If you apply that perception, hold that label in mind, and explore the way you feel the body from the inside, what does it do? You can think of the body as a big sponge, lots of holes for the breath to come in and out from all directions. The breath comes in and goes out without any sense of blockage, no problem at all. If you perceived it that way, what impact would it have on how you actually experience the breath? In other words, you learn to take these aspects of fabrication and use them to your advantage. And of course you're going to make mistakes, but you can learn from them. By learning how to notice things on your own, knowing how to seek advice from other people, learning how to apply their advice in a skillful way. So, on the one hand, the Buddha gives you a lot of instructions on how to avoid mistakes, but he also is very open to the fact that we're still going to make mistakes on one level or another. Instead of forbidding you from making mistakes, he gives you advice. When you make a mistake, this is how you handle it, this is how you learn from it, so you can become more skillful. This is how the process of fabrication can take you to the threshold where there's the unfabricated. You develop your tools, and, as with any art, you're not developing the tools because you want to take the tools with you. Say, for instance, you have some paintbrushes. You're not painting for the sake of paintbrushes, you use the paintbrushes for the sake of the art. And as you master the use of those paintbrushes, there comes a point where you've finished your artwork and you put the brushes aside. It's the same with the path. You work on developing these elements of the path. Learn how to notice when you've done it well and when you haven't. In that way you develop your skill. This skill, though, is special. It takes you to the threshold of the unfabricated. But you can't use the unfabricated to get to the unfabricated. It can't be used as a cause at all, for it lies totally outside of the realm of causality. But you can get there through causality, through learning fabrication, as you learn to fabricate states of mind more and more skillfully. So don't be afraid of mistakes. Try to avoid them as much as you can, but don't be afraid of the idea that there will be mistakes down the line. As Ajahn Fuang once said, no matter what happens in the meditation, there's always a cure for it if you develop the right attitude. So the conceit that says, I don't want to make any mistakes and simply wanting to will your way to a mistake-free life without doing anything, that you've got to put aside. The narcissism of not wanting anyone to be able to criticize you, that you've got to put aside. As the Buddha once said, if someone points out your faults, regard that person as someone who's pointed out treasure. So learn to live with the fact that, yes, we all make mistakes. Even arrogance makes some mistakes. But a mistake is not the end of the world. It's a start. It's a treasure in that it's your opportunity to learn. Experimental Intelligence. August 7, 2007. One of the most important principles in meditating on the breath is learning how to experiment with it. Try different kinds of breathing to see which rhythm, which texture of breathing feels best for the body right now, and which is also best for the mind. Some ways of breathing can put you to sleep, other ways of breathing get you irritated, so you want to check and see what kind of breathing is going to make it easiest for the mind to settle down in a state of mindful alertness and want to stay there. If the body is uncomfortable because of the way you breathe, you're not taking advantage of the fact that the breath can make it comfortable. I know a lot of people who are surprised by this aspect of Ajahn Lee's instructions for breath meditation. They come to meditation with the idea that you're supposed to let things simply happen on their own and not do anything to them, that you just watch the breath however it comes in, however it goes out. But even the Buddha's instructions on breath meditation frequently state that you train yourself to do things in a certain way. You train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, aware of the whole body as you breath out. You train yourself so that the breath calms down, giving rise to the next steps, where you can train yourself to breathe in with a sense of ease, with a sense of rapture. And then you can calm those feelings. There's an element of will in all this, an element of fabrication in which you intentionally cause things to happen. That's important for not only getting the mind to settle down with a sense of ease, but also for developing insight, because insight comes down to a matter of seeing cause and effect. I think it was Aristotle who defined intelligence as the ability to see connections. When you do X, Y happens. When you do Z, W happens. The ability to see that on your own is a sign of intelligence, and that sort of intelligence can be developed by learning to look for causes and effects. This is how you do it. You change certain things and see where the change has an impact. You change other things and see where that has an impact. If changing X causes Y to change every time, you know that X is a condition for Y. This principle permeates all of the Buddha's teachings. Everything is checked by the results it gives. When the Buddha was teaching his aunt the basic principles of the Dhamma, it came down to this. When you adopt a particular teaching, what effect does it have? Does it give rise to passion? To being fettered? To accumulating? To self-aggrandizement? To discontent? To entanglement? To laziness? To being burdensome? Then that's a wrong teaching. Does it give rise to the opposite qualities, such as dispassion, modesty, and not being fettered? Okay, that's a right teaching. That's how you know what's Dhamma and what's not. You take all the Dhamma you hear and you test it in terms of cause and effect. You don't take anything for granted just because you've heard that it's so. Sometimes we hear that the basic Buddhist insight is into the three characteristics: inconstancy, stress, not self, which doesn't seem to involve many connections between cause and effect. But here you have to remember two things. 1. The Buddha never talked about three characteristics. The phrase three characteristics doesn't appear in his teachings. That was something added later in the commentaries. He taught these three themes: inconstancy, stress, not self, as perceptions and contemplations, as labels you apply to things, and aspects you look for in your experience of things. But there's a larger context for looking for these things, or learning to see things in light of them. The larger context is formed by the Four Noble Truths. The fact that there is suffering, that there's a cause for suffering, that suffering can cease, and that there's a path of practice leading to its cessation. These truths in turn relate to a more basic issue: that the whole purpose of the Buddha's teachings is for the sake of finding true happiness. And he brings both the heart and the head together on this project. The heart's basic desire is for happiness with the least amount of effort, whereas the head is the part that recognizes that there are causes and effects, and that if you want to get anywhere, you have to learn this pattern and work within it. In following the Buddha's teachings, these two sides of your awareness, heart and head, have to learn to work together. The heart has to learn respect for the fact that if you want true happiness, it's going to require some work. You'll have to get the causes right. At the same time, the head has to recognize that true happiness is a worthwhile goal. You don't just think about things and analyze them just for the sake of spinning out ideas and showing you're smart. You want to understand cause and effect so that you can find true happiness. And as the Buddha traces out the causes of suffering, one of the big causes is clinging. So one way of learning how to let go of clinging is to see things in light of those three perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self. You don't stop with just seeing things in terms of those perceptions. At the same time, you have to learn the right time and place to apply them, when they actually serve the purpose of leading to a greater happiness. All the teachings have their time and place. You have to see each teaching in the larger structure of this pursuit of happiness and try to apply it in an intelligent way. A large part of this means that you have to be heedful. You can't just assume that anything that comes popping up in your mind, or any idea that you have, is going to lead to true happiness. You can't assume that any teaching you receive from anybody is going to lead to true happiness, or that you can apply it willy-nilly to everything that comes up. You have to test things to learn when and how they work. So a central part of the Buddha's teaching consists of instructions in the best way to test things. You start out by getting the mind to be still. Get it into strong states of concentration where everything is very, very still, so that you can observe, when a thought comes into the mind, what it does to the mind, or when you do an action, what it does to the mind. If things aren't really still, you can't see the impact of a thought, the impact of an action very clearly. It's like trying to listen to a very soft piece of music on the stereo at the same time that you've got a lawnmower outside, or trucks driving up and down the road. The background noise is so loud that it obscures the subtleties you're trying to hear. The same way with the mind. Unless you can get the mind really, really still, you can't really watch the effects of your actions, the effects of your words, the effects of your thoughts. Many actions may seem perfectly harmless in an ordinary state of mind, but when the mind gets really, really still, you begin to see that they actually have an adverse impact on the mind. So this is why we work at bringing the mind to concentration. This is why the Buddha said that concentration should be developed. He didn't say, states of concentration come and go. You just watch their coming and going and say, ah, yes, this is inconstant, stressful, not self. That's not the duty that the Four Noble Truths assign to concentration. The duty they assign is that when you encounter states of mindfulness, you try to develop them. When you encounter states of concentration, you try to develop them. Make them stronger, because you're going to need them as tools. Whatever serves as a tool on the path, you want to take care of it. You don't just let it go. The same with the breath. You work with it, you take care of it, because it's going to help you get the mind to settle down. It's going to help give you a good solid foundation. I know someone who went to study in Thailand after she'd been doing the Ajahn Lee method. She met a teacher who said, "What is this, improving the breath? You're supposed to let it go and be on its own. After all, it's just a sankhara, just a fabrication. Why try to improve it?" She reported to me what he had said. My response was, "Go back and ask him, why bathe your body? After all, it's just a sankhara, just let it go." Of course you can't do that. You've got to look after the body because you're using it as a tool. The same with the breath. You look after the breath, tend to it, because it helps the mind to settle down with a sense of ease and solidity that you're going to need for deeper insights. At the same time, as you're working with the breath, you get insight into cause and effect. Because even when the mind settles down and you see things, you've got to test them. Sometimes you hear the teaching that once the mind settles down, you get in touch with your Buddha nature or your inner stillness, and you can trust whatever your Buddha nature or inner stillness tells you. The Buddha never taught that way. Even stream enterers, he said, have got to be heedful. You can't trust everything that comes out of the mind. He even said that arahants had to be heedful about their actions. Even totally enlightened beings can't totally assume that everything they see or hear is actually the way it is. They have to test it. Go look in the Vinaya. A couple of the rules were actually formulated because some arahants made some mistakes. For instance, there's the rule against monks eating stored up food. Ven. Balatthasissa, who was an arahant, figured, well, I can just go for alms once a week, take the leftover rice, and dry it. That's a nice frugal way of living, and I don't have to go out for alms every day. Just eat the leftover rice from the days before. The Buddha found out about it and took him to task. He said, "This is not a wise course of action." The story doesn't explain what the Buddha's reasoning was, but if you look at the history of Buddhism, you see that down the line, in later centuries, when monks stopped going for alms, they created a rift in the Buddhist community at large. The monks lived on their own, they had their own kitchens, with monastery attendants to fix their food. Lay people basically stopped caring about the monks. And as a result, when the Muslims came into India and destroyed the monasteries, the lay people didn't really care. The connection had been severed. The Buddha saw that far ahead. So even fully awakened arahants can't always assume that what they think is true. They've got to test it and check it, just like everybody else. So when insights arise in your meditation, or when you gain an intuitive feel for something, the question is not where the insight comes from, but what happens when you apply it. You view it as a hypothesis in an experiment. You're developing an experimental intelligence here. You take the passages you read in the texts and you experiment with them. You take the insights you receive from meditation and you experiment with them. There's a passage in the very first sutta in the Dhyana listing all the different kinds of wrong views that people can develop, and not every wrong view comes from people simply thinking things out without having practiced meditation. A lot of wrong views come from people who meditate and gain some insights or intuitive knowledge, but the knowledge isn't as complete as they thought it was. So they jump to the wrong conclusions. What this means is that whether the source of your insight is something you've learned from the texts, something you thought out on your own, an intuitive feeling you have, or something that comes up in your meditation, you always have to test it to see. If I adopt this, where does it go? What does it connect with? What are the connections here in terms of cause and effect? That's how you test to see, in terms of the insights you gain, which ones are fool's gold, and which ones are genuine gold. You put them to use and then see what happens. And you always adopt the heedful attitude that says, I'm testing things here. I won't draw any firm conclusions until I've seen what actually works in freeing the mind. As the Buddha says, just because you like a particular truth or it seems to fit in with your worldview, that's no guarantee that it's actually true. We've all read the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha says not to take religious texts as being necessarily true. That's the part everybody seems to remember. The other part, though, is that he also says not to take what you like as necessarily being true. Don't take what seems to fit into your worldview as true. Don't take what seems to work out logically as necessarily being true. You've got to test things. When you adopt this or that idea, this or that practice, what happens? Check these things out not only against your own experience, but also against the experience of wise people. In this way, you're much more likely to find truths that really are true because they've stood up to the test. Of course, this means we have to be very careful in how we conduct our tests, which again is why we work at developing concentration, developing mindfulness, all the mental attributes of patience, endurance, alertness, honesty, and discernment. They put us in a position where we can test things and evaluate the results reliably, so that we're not overcome by bias, and we can overcome the limitations of the worldviews and ideas we bring to the practice. After all, the purpose of the practice is to see things we've never seen before, to attain things we've never attained before. That means you have to learn how to overcome the limitations of your assumptions. And this is how you do it. You adopt this experimental way of developing intelligence so that your heart's desire, a true happiness, will get fulfilled, even if it's not quite in the way you might have wanted it. After all, this does require work. But it's a path of work and of effort that leads ultimately to a happiness that, once you've attained it, doesn't require any effort to maintain. Only through gaining intelligence in terms of cause and effect can you find the happiness that ultimately lies beyond cause and effect. So we work with the nitty-gritty of just learning to observe what's going on in the mind, testing it, learning to put away whatever assumptions don't pass the test, because only through working through the details like this do we ultimately break through to something much larger and more lasting. 3 Perceptions. August 21, 2007. Almost any book on Buddhism will tell you that the 3 characteristics, the characteristic of inconstancy, the characteristic of stress or suffering, and the characteristic of not-self, were one of the Buddha's most central teachings. The strange thing, though, is that when you look in the Pali Canon, the word for 3 characteristics tilakkhana doesn't appear. If you do a search on any computerized version of the canon and type in, say, the characteristic of inconstancy, anicca, it comes up with nothing. The word's not in the Pali Canon at all. The same with dukkha and anatta. Those compounds don't appear. This is not to say that the concepts of anicca, dukkha, and anatta don't occur in the canon, just that they're not termed characteristics. They're not compounded with the word characteristic. The words they are compounded with are perception, sana, as in the perception of inconstancy, the perception of stress, and the perception of not-self, and the word anupassana, which means to contemplate or to keep track of something as it occurs. For instance, anicca, to contemplate inconstancy, means to look for inconstancy wherever it happens. Now, it's true that you'll frequently find in the canon the statements that all things compounded or fabricated are inconstant, that they're all stressful. And all dhammas, all objects of the mind, are not self. So if that's the way things are, why not just say that these are characteristic features of these things? Why make a big deal about the language? Because words are like fingers, and you want to make sure they point in the right direction, especially when they're laying blame, the way these 3 perceptions do. And in our practice, the direction they point to is important for a number of reasons. One is that the Buddha's concern is not with trying to give an analysis of the ultimate nature of things outside. He's more interested in seeing how the behavior of things affects our search for happiness. As he once said, all he taught was suffering and the end of suffering. The suffering is essentially an issue of the mind searching for happiness in the wrong places, in the wrong way. We look for a constant happiness in things that are inconstant. We look for happiness in things that are stressful, And we look for our happiness in things that are not self, that lie beyond our control. The three perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self are focused on our psychology, on how we can recognize when we're looking for happiness in the wrong way, so that we can learn to look for happiness in the right places, in the right ways. The contemplation of these three themes, the use of these three perceptions, is aimed at finding happiness of a true and lasting sort. So it's good to keep reminding ourselves of this point, because our prime focus in the meditation should always be on the mind. We're not trying to analyze things outside in and of themselves. We're trying to see how the mind's quest for happiness relates to the way things behave. You always want to keep your focus here, on the mind's quest, even when you focus on the breath. When the breath gets more and more refined, with a sense of ease filling the body, you reach a stage where the mind and the breath seem to become unified in one. The mind and its functions become more and more prominent in the meditation, and the breath as it grows more and more subtle fades into the background. This is just as it should be, because the mind is the culprit, the breath isn't the culprit. Things that are inconstant, stressful, and not self, they're not to blame. The problem is the way the mind looks to these things for happiness. Even when it looks for happiness in a relatively wise way, these issues are relevant. As the Buddha said, the beginning of wisdom is when you go to people who have found true happiness and you ask them, "What should I do that will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness?" Notice that. My long-term welfare and happiness. Those three categories are directly related to the three perceptions. The my is related to not self, long-term is related to inconstancy, welfare, and happiness is related to stress. The three perceptions act as ways of testing any happiness you find, to see if it measures up to the standards you set. But they follow on the "what should I do?" That has to come first. In other words, as we look for happiness, we focus first on actions that don't constitute ultimate happiness, but can be used as the path. Things like mindfulness, persistence, and concentration. At that stage, the Buddha doesn't have us focus too much on these three characteristics. He has us focus primarily on the doing. As part of the doing, we hold on to other perceptions. The perception of breath, say, or the perception of whatever our meditation object is. We make that prominent. And we try to push that perception into a state of solid concentration, which means that we're pushing it in the direction of making it constant and easeful, and getting it under our control. In this way, we're actually fighting the three characteristics as we try to bring the mind into concentration. We push to see how far we can find a happiness based on conditioned things. One reason for this is that if you don't push at a truth until it pushes back, you won't know how strong it is. Another reason is that we're going to need that conditioned happiness, that sense of relatively solid well-being, to put ourselves in a position where we can look at things very carefully as they come to be. That phrase, "as they come to be," comes into play when we're no longer pushing. But we've got to push first. So you keep working on your concentration in all your activities, trying to keep the mind as constantly still as possible, no matter what the outside conditions may be. You create the conditions for stillness inside, a sense of ease inside, and try to maintain that stillness and ease in the face of all sorts of conditions around you. You learn to gain more skill, more control. At this stage in the game, the issues of inconstancy, stress, and not self apply primarily to the things that would distract you from your concentration. You try to see that no matter how attractive or alluring or interesting other topics might be, they don't measure up to concentration as a source for happiness. They're less constant, more stressful, less under your control. So you drop them in favor of the bliss of concentration. You keep this up, gaining these insights, until you've fully mastered concentration, which, as the Buddha once said, happens well after your first taste of the deathless. This means that there's going to be a long period in which you're essentially working against the three characteristics, at least as far as your concentration is concerned. You'll use these three perceptions to analyze, say, any object of lust, anger, jealousy, or fear that would pull you out of concentration. These perceptions are relevant because they're ways of reminding yourself that you can't find true happiness in those objects. For the meantime, that's how you use the contemplation of these themes. And again, the focus is not so much on trying to get to the ultimate nature of these outside objects, as it is on using the perception as an antidote for a tendency of the mind. After all, these perceptions are not intended to be a statement of the ultimate nature of things out there, for, when you think about it, the ultimate nature of things out there is really not all that relevant an issue. We don't hang on to things because we think that they have an inherent nature, that they inherently exist or don't exist. We hang on to them because we think they're going to provide happiness that's worth whatever effort they involve. What the Buddha is pointing out is that they really don't provide that happiness. The happiness they do provide doesn't really measure up. It's not worth the cost. So you apply these 3 contemplations to things outside of your concentration, and then watch to see where the mind resists. In other words, what does it refuse to see as inconstant, stressful, and not self? When you can catch the mind resisting in this way, you've gained an insight into its attachments. You've found a spot where you need to dig down and question its resistance. What deluded fantasy is the mind trying to protect here? What attitude is it trying to hide from your scrutiny? In this way, the 3 contemplations keep coming back to the mind, as they highlight your attachments and tell you where you still have work to do. You can also apply these 3 contemplations to the first stages of concentration, when you want to go to deeper stages. When the mind is settled and quiet on a beginning level, is it as quiet as it could be? Or is there still some inconstancy there? If you see that any of the factors of your concentration are stressful or inconstant, you drop them, and that will take you to deeper stages of concentration. Ultimately, as your attachments to things outside of the concentration drop away, you turn your attention more to applying these 3 perceptions to contemplating the concentration itself. As this contemplation gets more refined, you see that even the most stable level of concentration you can attain, the one that has formed your highest experience of pleasure and ease, is composed of 5 aggregates on a very subtle level, and even on this subtle level their behavior displays these 3 features all the time. You apply the 3 perceptions to them to pry away even your attachment to concentration. That's when you incline the mind to the deathless, and, as the texts say, that inclination can take you in either of 2 directions. One is to non-returning, where you delight in your taste of nibbana as a Dhamma, as an object of the mind. The other is full arahantship, when you go beyond even that kind of delight. It's precisely at this fork in the road where the analysis of Sab Dhamma and Natta all Dhammas are not self applies. Where you might see nibbana as a Dhamma, as an object of the mind. As long as you perceive it in that way, there's going to be attachment, there's going to be a Dhamma to hold on to. So you have to learn how to overcome that attachment by applying the perception of not self to the Dhamma of the deathless. Then, the texts say, you let go of all Dhammas, which allows you to see nibbana in another way, not as a Dhamma, but as the abandoning of all Dhammas. That's the ultimate. And at that point, these 3 perceptions lose their function. They've done their work, so you can put them aside. After all, they're conditioned phenomena. When you've put all Dhammas aside, you put them aside, too. Arahants can continue using these perceptions as a pleasant abiding for the mind, to remind them of why they've got the ultimate happiness, but these perceptions are no longer needed in the task of bringing about release. So, remember, we're not here to arrive at the true nature of things in and of themselves, aside from seeing how their behavior makes them inadequate as sources for true happiness. The emphasis always points back to using the perceptions to counteract unskillful tendencies in the mind, because the issues of the mind are paramount. Ajahn Fuang once had a student in Singapore who wrote him a letter describing how his meditation had reached the point where it was concerned solely with seeing the 3 characteristics in everything he encountered. Ajahn Fuang had me write in reply, don't focus on things outside. Keep looking back at the mind to see what it is that keeps complaining that they're stressful, inconstant, and not self, because the fault lies not with the things. The fault lies with the mind that's looking for happiness in the wrong place. So that's where your attention should always be focused. On the machinations of the mind. Use whatever perceptions and means of contemplation that can cut through the mind's unskillful habits and apply them in a way that leads to the goal of the teachings. An unconditioned happiness where you can put all perceptions, skillful and unskillful, aside. Disenchantment. October 19, 2007. We all practice for the sake of happiness, for a happiness that goes deeper than ordinary pleasures. But in coming to the practice, we often bring assumptions about happiness, how it works, why we're unhappy, what we can do to be happier, assumptions that we're hardly even aware are assumptions because we assume them so strongly. We just take it for granted that they're true. And sometimes they get in the way. Two of the most common assumptions are ones that get most in the way. The first is that we're unhappy because we can't accept the way things are, that the purpose of the practice is to learn more acceptance. In other words, we're essentially neurotic, as in that old distinction between neurosis and psychosis. The psychotic person thinks that 2 + 2 = 5. The neurotic person knows that 2 + 2 = 4, but hates them for it. Our problem is that we simply can't accept the way things are. If we could only learn how to accept that 2 + 2 does = 4 and it's perfectly fine, then we'd be happy. And so in that model, the purpose of the practice is to learn acceptance. But even Freud recognized that getting people past their neuroses would not solve the problem of happiness. As he said, it would simply lead them to the level of ordinary everyday misery. And yet part of the common theory says, well, you have to learn how to accept that, because that's just the way things are. Another model is that we're unhappy because we have a sense of separateness. Inside we're divided. Outside we're separate from other people, we're separate from nature. All we need to learn is how to develop a sense of oneness, a sense of interconnectedness, and then we'll be happy. But that's not how the Buddha saw interconnectedness. He saw that the way things are interconnected in terms of cause and effect is actually a cause for suffering. And even a sense of oneness, he says, is inconstant. It contains a subtle sense of stress. If you cling to it, you're going to suffer. There's a passage in the canon where he describes the highest form of oneness, which is the oneness or non-duality of consciousness, in which you have a sense of consciousness as a totality, containing everything. Yet even that, he says, is inconstant, stressful, and not self. What these two ideas about happiness have in common is that the way things are out there is already a given, and we're simply on the receiving end of what's given, so we have to learn how to develop the proper attitude to what's already there. Accept and try to find oneness within the way things are. But the Buddha's take on things is different. Reality is only partly a given. We are also shapers of our reality. We have an active role in shaping every present moment that we experience. Now, the present moment is not entirely plastic, entirely responsive to everything we want out of it. Some of it is formed by influences coming in from the past, but part of it comes from our intentions in the present moment. In this way we are both producers and consumers. We produce our suffering and then we consume our suffering. We produce our pleasures and we consume our pleasures. Understanding this point helps to open the road to a deeper happiness, because there is a happiness, the Buddha said, that is not produced and not consumed. It just simply is. But the way we keep feeding on the happiness we produce gets in the way. So for him, the purpose of the meditation is not to celebrate oneness or to celebrate acceptance. It's to develop two very different kinds of emotions: disenchantment and dispassion. The Pali word for disenchantment, nibbida, also means distaste, disgust, or revulsion, which may sound strong, but it needs to be strong. It's an antidote to our strong attachment to feeding on things. That attachment, the Buddha said, is the essence of suffering. The word upadana, which means clinging, also means the act of eating, of taking sustenance. He says that upadana lies at the essence of suffering and stress. So what we need to learn is how to look at the things we feed on until we develop a strong sense that we don't want to feed on them anymore. Now to get to that point, the Buddha does have us develop a certain amount of acceptance and a certain sense of oneness. This is what the practice of concentration is all about. You start by focusing on one object, like the breath, and then you stay with it long enough that you start developing a sense of oneness with it. Your awareness of the breath and the breath itself seem to become one and the same thing. There's a sense of unification, a Bodhisattva, which the Buddha has us develop as much as possible. And he has us take that sense of oneness as far as it can go through the levels of concentration. Why? Because he wants us to feed on that and then to start comparing this food with the other things we've been feeding on, to see that this is a much more refined pleasure, a more satisfying form of nourishment. The pleasure it gives is blameless. The pleasure that comes from just focusing your mind. The pleasures we get from things outside contain a certain amount of blame, in that our taking pleasure means that other people, other animals, have to work, have to suffer in one way or another. An example is physical food. As we eat physical food, we gain pleasure, but to get that food to our plate or into our bowls requires a lot of work and sacrifice. So as the Buddha said, that's a pleasure that contains some blame. Or in Ajahn Lee's terms, it contains some karmic debts. Whereas the pleasure that comes simply from learning how to focus on your breath is not placing a burden on anyone, so it's a type of food for the mind that's really worth developing. As you develop a sense of oneness with the food of concentration, you look at the other ways the mind has been feeding on things for its emotional pleasures, and you realize that they're pretty miserable. The image the Buddha gives in the canon is of a blind person who has been given a soiled, oily rag by someone who says, "Look, this is a nice, clean, white piece of cloth." The blind person takes the oily rag and gets very possessive of it, thinking that it's a nice, clean, white piece of cloth. But when a doctor eventually cures the blind person of his blindness and he can start seeing, the first thing he looks at is his cloth. He realizes that it's not nice, clean, and white. It's a dirty and oily rag. He says, "Wow, I was really fooled by that guy." In the same way, the Buddha says that once you attain the first taste of awakening, you look back on your old pleasures and realize how you've been fooled by the mind, that in finding your pleasure, what you've been feeding on is just forms and feelings and perceptions and thought constructs in consciousness, which, when you really look at them very carefully, are not worth feeding on at all. There's a story they tell about the American occupation of Japan after World War II. There were some cooks in Japanese restaurants who were really upset by the fact that they had lost the war, and now they had to prepare food for the occupiers. So, to get some revenge, they would take human excrement and prepare it with all kinds of wasabi or whatever to mask the taste, and then serve it to their American customers. They would feed the occupiers shit, basically, and the occupiers didn't know. So the cooks got their perverse pleasure that way. If you look at what you've been taking as food for the mind, you realize that it's just the same sort of thing, that all the pleasure was in the preparation. This is why we have the contemplation of the 32 parts of the body, the analysis of things in terms of the aggregates, in terms of the sense media, in terms of the properties. So we can realize that the food of lust or possessiveness we've been feeding on with regard to the body is really not based on much. It doesn't give us any real sustenance, and the pleasure we get out of it is certainly not worth all the effort that goes into dressing it up. The purpose of this contemplation is to gain that sense of nibbida, disenchantment or revulsion with the food we've been consuming, so that we won't want to eat it anymore. When you decide you don't want to eat it, you turn around and look at the fact that you've been preparing this food all along, and you realize you don't want to prepare it any longer. That's dispassion. You've had a passion for creating this food out of form, feeling, whatever. That's why it was there as food. But once you gain a sense of dispassion for it, you stop creating it. And when you stop creating it, it's no longer there. That's when you experience cessation. The mind is no longer entangled either in the process of production or in the process of consumption. That's when it's freed. It opens to the happiness that's there when you're not so wound up or enthralled in production and consumption of all these miserable forms of food. So the Buddha's take on true happiness is very different from a lot of the assumptions we tend to bring to the practice. It's important to keep this fact in mind. We're not totally on the receiving end of things. We're producers and consumers at the same time. And the producing and consuming of our ordinary pleasures, or even some of our more refined pleasures, is what's getting in the way of realizing a happiness that goes beyond all this, that's not dependent on being connected or unconnected. It's not dependent on accepting or not accepting. It's just there. But to find it, we have to develop a sense of disconnect with our old enthrallments. And we have to decide not to accept the way things have been. In this way, the Buddha has a very different approach to how and where to find true happiness. But the happiness that comes is a lot truer than anything that can come from simply learning how to accept things or learning how to become one with them. So try to keep this point in mind, that you're both a producer and a consumer, and take a good hard look at what you've been producing and how you've been consuming it. Look at all the effort that goes into producing happiness out of this body we have, out of feelings and perceptions and thought constructs and consciousness. Start asking yourself, is it really worth all the effort? Maybe there's something better. Maybe it's time to grow up. When you can develop that sense of disenchantment and dispassion, it leads to cessation. Then you realize that cessation is not a scary thing. It's not like extinction. It's more like learning how to outgrow some old bad habits, your old addictions, your old intoxications, and finding that there's something a lot better there when you put your old feeding habits aside. Becoming. July 23, 2007. Try to keep track of the breath. Don't think about the fact that you're going to be here for a whole hour. Just think about this breath, and then this breath, each breath, one breath at a time. Think about it and watch it, see what it does. What do you notice when it comes in? What do you notice when it goes out? What way of coming in feels best for the body? What way of letting it go out feels best for the body? The breath is called the fabricator of the body, or bodily fabrication kaya sankhara, both because the way you breathe has a huge impact on the way you experience your body, and because there's an intentional element in the breath. It's one of the few bodily processes that can be either voluntary or involuntary. So make the most of the fact that you can exert some voluntary control over it. You can choose when to breathe in, you can choose when to breathe out. Then it's a matter of learning the best reasons for choosing to breathe in or breathe out in any particular way. Can you sense how the body tells you that now's a good time for an in-breath, now's a good time for an out-breath? It has its signals, you know. There are certain feelings in the body that you can learn to recognize over time, and you can explore how best to respond to them. Take their cue in such a way that it leads to a sense of fullness. For example, you can breathe until the body feels full, and then you don't squeeze it out. Allow it to stay full. Even though the breath will go out, you can still maintain some sense of fullness. When the next breath comes in, add a little bit more fullness. The same with the next and the next. It builds up over time. Simply by approaching the breathing process in a particular way, you can create a state of ease, you can create a state of fullness, even a sense of fullness that's a bit too much. Sometimes people can begin to feel that they're going to drown in breath energy. You might want to temper that a little bit. But as long as the fullness feels refreshing and blissful, stick with it. There was once a senior monk in Bangkok who was learning meditation from Ajahn Lee. He was well read and knew his Buddhist doctrine. After a while of practicing concentration, he complained to Ajahn Lee, "As we bring the mind to concentration like this, aren't we developing states of becoming and birth?" Bhava and jati are the words he used. You may have noticed as we were chanting the sutta on setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion just now. The craving that leads to further becoming is the craving that leads to suffering as well. The senior monk was reasoning from this point, saying that we should be trying to abandon states of becoming and birth, and yet here we are creating them. And Ajahn Lee said, precisely. That's what we're doing. If you want to understand becoming and birth, you have to consciously create these states. Create a state of well-being, create a state of fullness, get good at it. That's when you understand the process. Before you take things apart, you have to learn how to put them together. And that's what we're doing right now, creating a state of becoming, a state of well-being or well-becoming. We do this both so that we can get good at creating it, and so that, in the course of creating it, we can put the mind in a good spot where it can watch things more carefully, more clearly. When the mind is comfortable in the present moment, at ease in the present moment, it can stay firmly in the present moment and watch processes transparently as they come, as they go. You get a better sense of your raw materials. The creating of a state of becoming in the mind like this is the karma of your meditation, right here, right now. A lot of people believe that karma is one of those teachings that's not particularly relevant to their meditation practice. But essentially, karma is what the practice is all about. After all, karma is what you're doing to create suffering. Changing your karma is what's going to bring suffering to an end. The Buddha tends to avoid talking about metaphysical issues, but karma is the one big metaphysical issue he talks about a lot. The nature of action, what action does, when it gives its results, the fact that action is real, that it gives results both immediately and over time. These are metaphysical issues. And the reason the Buddha focuses on these and not on other issues is because the nature of action is important for understanding why we suffer and how we can stop suffering. There's the karma that leads to suffering, there's the karma that leads to its end. So we're here trying to understand what action is all about, what action does, and what it creates. And our state of concentration is Exhibit A, our primary example of action right here. We're creating a state of well-being. You can't let go of states of well-being until you learn how to make good ones. Ajahn Lee's example, when he was talking to that senior monk, was of having a chicken that lays eggs. Some of the eggs, he said, you can take apart and analyze, some of the eggs you can eat. If you don't have anything to eat, you don't have the strength to take things apart and analyze them. We're feeding on the sense of ease that comes from the concentration because that gives us the strength to analyze things. How do you analyze things? You take things apart in terms of what you're fabricating and of the raw materials with which you're fabricating them. For example, we all know the teaching that you create a sense of self out of any of the 5 aggregates, all of which are activities. Well, you can watch yourself as you meditate. Exactly how do you create a sense of me or mine around what you're doing? One thing you tend to see very quickly is the way your sense of self gets involved as you watch yourself doing the meditation well or poorly. When things aren't going well, you think you're a hopeless meditator. You get all tied up in knots. When they're going well, you get complacent and think you're a great meditator. Either way, you set yourself up for trouble. But when you realize that this is the process of I making and my making in action, you learn to leave things at the level of the raw materials. You don't have to make an I out of them, just notice that there are feelings, perceptions, fabrications. As you watch these things even more carefully, you begin to realize that even these aggregates have an element of fabrication, an element of intention, in what you thought was their raw form. As the Buddha says, we create form for the sake of formness. Your sense of the form of the body is something you fashion out of sensations, so that you can breathe and move. You can create formless states as well. This is what you learn when you move from the 4th jhana into the 4 formless states. The infinitude of space, the infinitude of consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception. You realize that you do create a sense of form with regard to the body by the way you move the breath around. When the breath is very, very still, that sense of form begins to disintegrate, to dissolve away, and you have the choice of not applying the perception of form to the body. You become sensitive to the space that permeates between the atoms of sensation making up your sense of the body. All the places where you feel space in the body begin to connect, and then they connect with the space outside. It's as if you have a mist of atoms here. In order to breathe, you applied perceptions, i.e., mental labels to that mass of mist. You had an image of the form of the body that allowed you to make it move. But when you don't have to move the body around, you don't even have to move the breath around, everything grows very still, And you can drop that sense of form if you want to. You can choose instead to focus on the perception of space permeating the mist. That's when you experience the infinitude of that space, and at that point you begin to realize that even the perception of form or the experience of form contains an element of intention. You then begin to see this process in relation to the formless realms as well. When you drop the perception of space, you're left with a perception of knowing. That's how you move from a sense of the infinitude of space to the infinitude of consciousness. These experiences can be willed, and the fact that they're so subtle allows the willing to be transparent. What you're doing is to take your experience apart, layer by layer, seeing where the different levels of intention get involved and learning how to drop them. As you progressively do away with these layers of intention, you get down to what the Buddha calls knowledge of things as they have come to be. As he said, only when he had gained knowledge of things as they have come to be in terms of the Four Noble Truths and the 3 levels of knowledge about each truth, did he claim full awakening. That's the kind of knowledge we're working our way down to. And the only way you can get down to that level of unintended, unshaped, unfabricated experience, getting down to the absolutely rawest of the raw materials of the present moment, is first by consciously putting them together into something. Otherwise, you miss a lot of subtleties. Sometimes you hear people say, try to sit with things simply as they are, right from the very beginning of the meditation, and you can get into a state of equanimity or pure mindfulness. And then you realize that that equanimity is unfabricated. Equanimity and mindfulness. That's it, that's the unfabricated. But that's not the case at all. Equanimity and mindfulness, when they're pure, constitute the 4th jhana, not the unfabricated. There's an element of fabrication in mindfulness, there's even an element of fabrication in equanimity. But unless you learn consciously how to fabricate mindfulness and equanimity for long periods of time and then how to observe them, you won't notice this. This is why you have to build up these states of concentration before you can start taking them apart. There's a sutta where the Buddha talks about the issue of thirsting for becoming, thirsting for non-becoming, and seeing things as they have come to be. He starts out with 2 extremes. There are people who just love becoming this, becoming that, creating states of being as much as they can, and there are other people who want to destroy states of being. They've gotten sick of what they've done in terms of creating their world and their experiences, and they just want to destroy the whole thing. The Buddha says that neither extreme is proper. In creating things, you just create more suffering. That point is obvious. But in destroying these things, you create a different kind of state of becoming, the process of searching for non-becoming. That, he says, simply leads to more becoming. You take on the identity of the destroyer, the annihilator. The trick is to see simply what has come to be, i.e., to see the raw materials you've been shaping into the present simply as that, as raw materials, and then learn to develop dispassion for them. It's as if you've been building houses with what you thought were bricks. But if you look carefully at the bricks, you realize that they're actually frozen meat. Of course, any house built out of frozen meat, as it gets exposed to the heat, is going to turn into a big pile of rotting flesh. When you realize that, you develop this passion for the activity of building houses, you develop this passion for the raw materials. That's when you let go. You don't have to destroy the houses. They disintegrate on their own. The issue here is learning to see the raw materials simply as they are, as something that's come into being through your past karma. And no matter how skillful you are at building an elaborate house with lots of gingerbread and balconies and whatever, it's still frozen meat and it's going to thaw. So when you develop this passion for what's come to be, you find true freedom. You stop this process of fabricating, building, creating states of being. You don't have to destroy the states of being. Simply the fact that you stopped creating them, stopped clinging to them, lets them fall away on their own. And your dispassion means that you won't replace them with new ones. It's a subtle skill, which means that you can't go straight to the letting go. First, you've got to learn how to build properly. Only then can you see the subtleties of the intentions in the mind and, at the same time, Get a felt sense for your raw materials. Otherwise you hold to the intention of being equanimous and think that that's it. Or to the intention of being totally passive, non-reactive, and think that that's it without seeing that that, too, is an intention, that, too, has an element of will that keeps it going. So try to be as skillful as you can in staying with the breath, in creating a sense of well-being through the breathing, because it teaches you a lot of important lessons about the element of karma, the element of will and fabrication that goes into the present moment. It teaches you about the raw materials and the many levels of intention there within them. You take these raw materials and turn them into a transparent state that allows you to watch these processes in action, so that someday you, too, can reach that point where, after putting things together, you can take them apart, see things simply as they come into being, develop dispassion for them, and drop them. That way you can test for yourself. When the Buddha said that there is an unfabricated, is what he said really true? It may seem like we're going in the opposite direction as we fabricate concentration here, but the only way you're going to see what's unfabricated is if you're totally sensitive to every level of fabrication possible. So although we're creating a state of becoming here with the breath, a state of well-being, a state of rapture, ease, unification of mind, as Ajahn Lee says, you're going to need to eat some of these eggs. You can't take them all apart, you can't destroy all of them. You've got to eat some of them in order to keep going. So feed yourself well. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.